Hello everyone, Charles 2 here, and today I have a discussion between Maddox and Rucka Rucka Ali to comment on. Now I know I said this wouldn't be coming out, but it is, and you have Rucka and Maddox himself to thank for that. I got in touch with Rucka, and Rucka got me in touch with Maddox, and Maddox actually had the file saved. I had deleted my copy of these clips, and Maddox generously went through the hassle of several attempted transfers of this file to me. Eventually I got it, and so I could re-extract the clips I wanted to use. So this only exists because of Maddox, so I just want to express my gratitude to him and Rucka up front, especially since the rest of this video, or most of it at least, will be spent criticizing Maddox. I should also say that he wanted to be clear that he was speaking off the cuff and in some cases arguing just for the sake of making the stream interesting. So, as I always say on the podcast, when you speak off the cuff, you can say all kinds of things. So, just keep that in mind. But in any case, however you judge Maddox is not what's particularly important. What's important is the ideas. So I'm just going to use him as a backboard against which I can express my own view. So let's get into it.
What are some other games in Sega Saturn to kind of bring this back full circle?
So Snatcher was one of my top 3 games of all time.
So it probably wasn't very good. I don't mean to disrespect you in any way.
You just did really hard.
But like, if this was your favorite, chances are I would not like it.
Well, I figured since I was going to be criticizing Maddox, I would start out with one thing we have in common, which is a love for Snatcher. Snatcher is an old Sega CD game made by Hideo Kojima, and it is excellent. I love it. I actually have a copy of it, which is worth a few $100s last time I checked, because it came out on the short-lived and doomed Sega CD, in America at least. I heard Maddox say once years ago that Snatcher was one of his favorite games, and that shocked me because I was a huge fan of it, and it's a cult status. It's not mainstream popular, but it has a following among certain people, so that surprised me. And then when it came up again in this stream, I thought, was that a fluke? Did he really mean it? Is he going to bring it up? And he did bring it up. So I'm happy he really does love Snatcher.
You need to have such simple principles, basic principles, such as my 5 senses inform me of what's happening in front of me. That's a principle.
Your senses deceive you all the time.
Oh,
yeah.
Now we get to the bottom of it.
Not even, no, they do. Your senses deceive you. Your eyes can be deceived. Your hearing can be deceived.
Wow.
Your senses cannot deceive you. Let me put this in the most provocative terms possible. There is no such thing as misperceiving. There is no such thing as misperception. There's no such thing as mishearing what someone said. That is impossible. Now, what is happening in instances people call mishearing is that you are inferring what somebody said based on insufficient data. What the person said was garbled, so you're trying to interpolate, extrapolate. What did this person actually say? It wasn't clear, but you heard what you heard. You didn't mishear anything. You just didn't get enough of the sound waves hitting you in the right way or whatever. But what you heard, you heard. There's no deception there. Now, your inference about what the person said may be wrong, but that's the inferential part of the equation. It's not the actual data that's wrong. The data is never wrong. Your inference can be wrong, but the data itself is just the data. You cannot misperceive, you cannot mishear. There is no such thing as an invalid report from the senses. The senses simply tell you what happens when your sense organs interact with something in the world. That cannot be wrong. It can't be wrong. It's like calling a tree wrong. You go out and you look at a tree. Is the tree wrong? Is the tree incorrect? No, it's a tree. It's the standard of right and wrong. Right and wrong applies once you get on the free will level, the abstract level, where you can make correct abstract statements or incorrect abstract statements. Because these statements are statements that correspond to the real world or don't. If they don't, you say they're wrong. If they do, you say they're right. But the standard is whether they correspond to existence. Existence doesn't correspond to anything. Existence is the standard of correspondence. So the senses have the same status as anything in the world. The senses aren't even true, your sensory awareness of things. That's not true or false. It's not valid or invalid. That is a category error. Valid, invalid, right, wrong, correct, incorrect. That applies once you get to the abstract level. Once you're making statements that don't necessarily correspond to something else. But the senses are just the senses. They have the same status as the world itself, just as you would never say, oh, this tree, this rock, this table is wrong. That doesn't make any sense, and you understand that. The senses are exactly the same thing. You can't say the senses are right or wrong. They just are. Your sensory perceptual awareness is the standard of which abstract statements are right or wrong. But your sensory perceptual awareness itself is neither right nor wrong. Those concepts don't apply just the same way they don't apply to things in the world. So I hope that's clear. Whatever awareness you have is a result of rock solid cause and effect. This thing in the world interacted with my sense organs in a mechanical way, and that produced this experience of awareness. There's no way for that to be wrong. That's just cause and effect. You can't see something incorrectly, because seeing just means, oh, something in the world interacted with my sense organs in a certain way. That's it. That can't be wrong. That's what happened. Now, you can make invalid inferences on that basis, but your awareness is just a fact about how your sense organs interacted with the world, and nothing can ever overturn that. You know, if you look at a table and you say, oh, that's a table, and it turns out to be a hologram. Okay, your abstract conclusion was overturned, but the fact that you saw what you saw the hologram, that you saw what you saw, whatever it is, that can never be overturned. Now, your abstract inference about what it is can be, but the fact that you saw what you saw, that is inviolable, immutable. No matter what its nature turns out to be, what you can say for sure about it is it's the kind of thing that looked to you like it did. And that's a fact.
First of all, reality, it doesn't exist. It's constructed in your mind, because the amount of time it takes for my words to reach your ear is infinitesimal, but a finite amount. And in between that time, your mind has to process what I said and then construct a reality based on what I said. And in fact, it's different for different people. There's no such thing as memories. There's no such thing as shit, I just forgot what I was going to say. But anyway, yeah, reality is constructed in your mind. So it's like not this objective thing that you can just observe with your senses.
So Maddox is saying that your senses are subjective. In a sense, they create the world. And he believes that the alternative to this, the only alternative, is a philosophical theory called naive realism. Maddox has actually brought this theory up by name in the past, as if it were the only alternative to this subjective view of sense perception. I am not a naive realist, because I disagree with its fundamental premise, which Maddox actually agrees with. The Maddox subjectivist view and the naive realist view both agree. If your mind has an identity, has a nature, if it takes information from the world and gives it to you in a certain form, if you are aware of the world only because it interacts with your sense organs and your sense organs have a specific form, then you are seeing the world from a certain perspective, the perspective given to you by the particular nature of your sense organs. Therefore, you're not seeing the world as it really is if your mind has any kind of nature, any kind of identity. They both agree on that. Now, what the Maddox types say is, well, it's obvious. You learn about reality in a certain form. Therefore, you don't really know anything about reality. It's constructed in your mind, as he just said. The naive realist accepts the premise but says, oh no, we do know about reality because your mind doesn't process the information at all. Your mind has no identity. It has no nature. It's this amorphous thing that takes the shape of what's out there in the world. Plato used the analogy of wax. You know, you have a ball of wax and you can stamp a seal into it, and the wax takes on the form of the seal because it's this malleable, amorphous blob of nothing. I mean, wax isn't really nothing, but this is just a metaphor. So that's the naive realist view of the mind. Your mind isn't really anything. It just takes on the form of what's out there in the world. So let's go back to trees again. Apparently I love trees. So Maddox says, okay, you go out there and you look at a tree, but what you're seeing, the greenness of the leaves, the brownness of the trunk, the texture, all of that is just your perspective. That's just what it looks like to you with your kinds of sense organ. That's not what the tree really looks like. That's just how you perceive it. And what the naive realist says is, oh no, that's what the tree really looks like. Because our senses, our minds, aren't processing it at all. Our minds are just taking on the form of the tree. So we're seeing it unprocessed. We're seeing it from no perspective. Our minds have no identity. They just take on the form that's out there in the world. That's the naive realist view, and it is completely wrong. Now, the truth here is that your mind does have a nature. So do things out there in the world. So you are seeing the tree from a certain perspective. But that doesn't mean that's not what the tree looks like. That is precisely what it looks like to an organism with your kinds of sense organs. So there is, quote-unquote, processing involved, but processing is not distortion. Having a perspective is not distortion. Having a form of awareness is not a lack of awareness. It's not an awareness of nothing. Here's the idea. The naive realist says, well, you're aware of the tree in no form. The Maddox type says, well, you're not really aware of the tree. You're aware of the image of the tree that comes into your mind through the senses. Now, the objectivist view goes back ultimately to Thomas Aquinas. He was the first one who discovered this. You know, people talk about Aquinas as being Aristotelian, bringing Aristotelian philosophy back, but people don't know exactly what he said concretely or what his improvements were on Aristotle. This is one of them, a major one. Although he didn't treat it as major, it's kind of a side thing that seems to happen a lot. A lot of times, you know, people who do groundbreaking things don't quite realize what part of what they're doing is groundbreaking. Anyway, so this was a major understanding. In Objectivism, we call this the form-object distinction. But it goes back to Aquinas, and he called it that which versus that by means of which. There's a Latin phrase for it, I can't remember, but that's what it translates to. And it's the idea that there is the thing you are aware of, the object of awareness, and the form in which you are aware of it. So what Maddox wants to say is that we are aware of an image of the tree in our mind. Wrong. We are aware of the tree in the form of that image, if you want to call it that. But the form is not this separate thing. No, that's your form of awareness of the world. The things you see aren't processed images of the world. You're not aware of images of the world. You're aware of the world in the form of those images. So really, you could reduce this to quantitative terms in a sense. The naive realist says there's only one thing. There's out there. and you just have it in your mind. The tree just comes into your mind, and that's it. You have the tree. Well, that's wrong, because you do see the tree from a certain perspective. But then the Maddox subjectivist type says, well, there are three things here. There's the tree, and then your image of the tree, and then you being aware of the image of the tree. No, really there are two. There's the thing out there, the tree, and then there's your form of awareness of it. There's not just the unprocessed so-called tree in your mind, and there's not an image of the tree in your mind. There is your form of awareness of the tree. And having a certain form of awareness is no kind of distortion. Yes, other people can be aware of the same facts of reality in different forms, but none of those forms of awareness will contradict each other because they're based on the same objective thing that is out there in the world with the same nature, independent of what sense organs it's interacting with. Now, if you have different sense organs from somebody else, you have different eyeballs, somebody's colorblind, you're not, then the same thing will appear different to you than it does to him. But that's fine, because the thing out there still is what it is. And as long as you understand that your awareness is a product of the objective, solid, causal interaction of two things that have objective identities, then there's no problem. The problem is just, if you treat it like a naive realist, then colorblindness is a real problem. Because if you see the same thing differently, obviously there's some kind of processing going on. Your mind is affecting your form of awareness of the thing, and that shouldn't happen on the naive realist view. So naive realism is a disaster, but the alternative is not subjectivity. It's just a recognition of the fact that being aware of something means being aware of something in a specific form. But what you are aware of still is what it is and doesn't change depending on who's viewing it, or with what sense organs or in what form.
No, I'm not saying reality is unknowable, but I'm just saying it's not accurate and it's not reliable. Your senses are not reliable. Do you disagree with that?
Your senses are
not reliable. They're absolutely not. They are not reliable.
The only thing I want to comment on here is that if your senses were unreliable, as Maddox is saying, then you truly would never be able to know anything, because your senses are your only standard. How do you even know your senses are unreliable? By what standard? How did you figure that out? How did you figure out your senses weren't reliable? What did you refer to? What source of knowledge did you have that led you to believe, oh, when I saw this, that was wrong? Well, the only possible source of knowledge is your senses. So you used your senses to overturn your other senses? Well, how do you know which one was actually right then? How did you know which sense overturns the other? Your fundamental source of information, source of awareness, cannot be unreliable. There is no degrees regarding that. It is either absolutely reliable or you have total skepticism and you can't know anything. You have to have something you can take as absolutely unassailable. Because if your senses are unreliable sometimes, even just once, ever, well, now you have no idea which time was it reliable and which time wasn't it. There's nothing higher by reference to which you can judge. It's just this sense versus this sense. If you have two perceptions that contradict, which is impossible, but if you did, you would have no way of knowing which one was right. All you could do is say, well, maybe if I see this kind of thing more often, then I'll say it's right. But you don't know that. It could just be that you just happened to see the truth once and all these other times are wrong. So if your senses really were unreliable, you could never know anything. But thankfully, that's not the case. They are totally reliable and unimpeachable.
You know, philosophy is important for our sense of ethics. I think our ethics a lot of times comes from a philosophy. There's no scientific explanation for ethics. We can't explain why it's wrong to steal. It's just a social construct. And you can make an argument that it's bad to steal because there may be repercussions, but that's not a scientific reason. You can't say for a certainty that if you steal, you will always have a certain outcome.
So, first he says, well, morality isn't scientific because it's a social construct. And then he goes against that and says, well, even if you say it's not a social construct, something is bad because it leads to these results, which is the right way to think about it. It's still not scientific because you can't say that this kind of action will lead to this kind of result all the time. But this is more epistemological than ethical. This isn't a case that morality is unscientific. It's a case that nothing is scientific. It's a case that we just can't ever identify cause and effect. Maybe we can have rules of thumb, but we can't ever be sure that a cause and effect relationship absolutely holds in a certain context. Now, that is completely wrong, but I'm glad he's, at least here in this clip, admitting that much, because if you can get the conversation there, you've basically already won. Then it's just a question of how do we establish cause and effect. But if you can get somebody to understand that morality is a factual question of cause and effect, you basically already won the battle. Now, I've discussed many times about how certain things are simply self-evidently good, such as happiness, and happiness requires life, and in fact is a result of successfully achieving life, so morality is really just the scientific question of how do you achieve life? Your own survival, and that's an objective question, no different from what causes gravitational attraction. I can't go into all of that here, but if you agree that we have discovered, at least in an important sense, what causes gravity, then you understand how we can figure out morality, objectively.
Well, at least now you're admitting that there is some sort of practical use for philosophy. If you're saying it teaches us not to steal. But here's what I'm saying. If philosophy says an item is what it is. This was Aristotle's contribution to the world, if nothing else. He said everything is what it is.
Aristotle did not actually say A is A or identify the law of identity. It's implicit in everything he does, but no surviving work of his actually states it. Now, we don't have all of Aristotle's work, and it would not surprise me if he had written it somewhere, but we don't have it, and even people far in the past did not understand him to have said it. The first person, historically, that we know identified the law of identity is Antonius Andreas, a medieval philosopher. But that's just a factual point. It is true that you absorb it from Aristotle implicitly, because it's so strongly there in everything he's doing. I mean, Aristotle worked out deduction. And logic is based on non-contradiction, and non-contradiction is nothing other than the epistemological tool you derive from the metaphysical law of identity. If everything is what it is and isn't what it isn't, then you know any kind of cognitive process that takes steps can't involve any contradictions between those steps, because things are what they are. And so if you have two steps that say a thing is X and a thing is non-X, then you know you messed up.
Yeah, for a guy that doesn't believe in the validity of the law of identity and existence, you're very much in touch with reality.
I didn't say I didn't believe in it. I believe in it. I'm saying, it's a nuance, Rucka. It's a nuance. I'm saying that you can't gain any knowledge from that. That's not knowledge about the world. You're not going to see that in a science book. You're not going to see that in an English book. It's not knowledge. It's philosophy. It's logic. I mean, it's fine if you want to talk about that, but it's not science. It's not knowledge.
A is A, the law of identity, gives us a lot. It is the foundation of all science, of all inferential knowledge, all inference, all logic. Anything that we have to learn in steps depends on the law of identity because it depends on non-contradiction. You couldn't do logic if you didn't have the rule of non-contradiction. If you didn't care about non-contradiction, then any series of steps whatsoever would be valid. But then they wouldn't correspond to reality. So having A is A, having the law of identity, and on that basis, the law of non-contradiction allows us to engage in cognitive processes, step-by-step processes, that allow us to understand more of the world, to make progress, to be able to understand more about the world than we can observe in a single frame of awareness. So you really cannot overstate the value of the law of identity. It is at the foundation of all human knowledge. All cognition depends on it.
The Cartesian philosophy of I think therefore I am is the most profound philosophical thing I've ever learned.
Well, I'm sympathetic because in our modern skeptical world, it's understandable people would look for unshakable foundations, which was the Cartesian Method, and he decided, well, the one thing I can't doubt is that I'm aware. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Now, the problem with this is that it actually takes a metaphysical derivative and epistemological simultaneity as primary, or it excises it from the whole context. You can't be aware without an object of awareness. There is no thinking without thinking about something. The first thing you know is that something exists. Now, implicit in that is that you are aware of it, so really it's simultaneous, but in metaphysical fact, there has to be something first, and then you're aware of it. You can't be aware before something exists. So saying, well, what I can't doubt is that I'm aware, but the external world, who knows, I have to infer that. No. If anything, the external world comes first. There's a sense in which it does, although you're aware of existence and consciousness simultaneously. So, I think therefore I am is true, but if you take that as your starting point, that's a big mistake because it implies that you have to infer existence from consciousness. No.
Yeah, Necker, if that's how to pronounce your name, that's my axiom. My starting point is that everything is what exists. My other axiom is that I'm conscious. Okay? And I know you want to explain that away, but it is self-evident.
Why?
Because I'm conscious.
Well, where's the evidence?
That I'm conscious.
Prove you're not a simulation.
Proving you're not a simulation, what does that even mean or have to do with consciousness? Even if you are a simulation in whatever sense he could possibly mean it, given that you are conscious, it wouldn't change the fact that you are conscious. It doesn't matter what the nature of that is. There's no possibility that you're wrong about your being conscious or about your being aware of the external world, even if you're wrong about the nature of the external world or the nature of what produces consciousness, whatever. The idea that, well, you have to prove your consciousness. What would you even accept as proof if you're going to doubt something that fundamental? That is just incoherent nonsense. Anyway, that's everything I wanted to comment on here. I know I've had this video on the docket for a while, and I'm glad to finally get around to it. I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I will be on the lookout. And feel free to send me suggestions if you have some particular thing somebody said that you want me to comment on, debunk, whatever, some argument you would like to hear criticized from an objectivist perspective. I am happy to do that. I love doing that. So right now I have nothing scheduled, so now's the time to suggest things if you would like to see that done. Anyway, thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video or podcast episode. Bye.